In the summer of 1934, a farmer named Harold Gibbs stood on his cracked Oklahoma land and watched his neighbor's barn disappear into a wall of black dust moving faster than a freight train. He had 9 children, $30 in the bank, and a government man telling him to pack up and head to California. Harold did not pack. Instead, he walked back to his porch, sat down, and started doing what his grandfather had taught him to do when the land turned against you. He started thinking like a survivor. 3 years later, Harold's homestead was one of only 4 still operating in his county. His wheat yield was modest, but it was real. His well had not run dry. His topsoil, though thin, was still there. His children were still there. What Harold knew, and what the government men and the city newspapers never quite understood, was that the Dust Bowl did not destroy farming. It destroyed farming done the wrong way. The men and women who survived that decade did it not with money or machinery or luck, but with an arsenal of small, precise, brilliantly adaptive tricks that had been passed down through generations and then refined in the crucible of the worst agricultural disaster in American history. We found 25 of those tricks. Some of them you will recognize. A few of them have been deliberately forgotten by the agricultural industry because they make modern chemical farming look unnecessary. And number 7 on this list was actually banned in 3 counties because it made the county grain elevator nervous. If you are the kind of person who respects knowledge that actually works, subscribe right now and hit the bell because we publish this kind of thing every single week, and you do not want to miss it. Number 25 starts right now. Number 25, planting a windbreak before you needed one. The farmers who survived the Dust Bowl almost universally had one thing in common that the ones who failed did not. They had planted trees years before the storms came. Not ornamental trees. Not fruit trees first, though those came later. They planted cottonwoods and Osage orange and native elms in rows along the north and west edges of their property, the directions from which the worst winds blew. A single row of trees was not enough. The real trick was planting 3 rows, staggered, so that wind had to slow down multiple times before it reached the crops. The trees were planted tight enough that a man walking between them had to turn sideways. Most of these farmers had no idea that the great black storms were coming. They planted windbreaks because their fathers had told them the land would always try to blow away if you let it, and trees were cheaper than fencing. When the storms hit, those living windbreaks dropped wind speed by as much as 50% in the fields behind them, which meant the soil stayed on the ground instead of traveling to Kansas. Number 24, leaving crop stubble in the field through winter. This one sounds like laziness, but it is the opposite. After harvest, most farmers in the early 20th century plowed their fields clean, leaving bare soil exposed from October through April. The farmers who survived the Dust Bowl had quietly stopped doing this. They left the stalks and roots of their previous crop standing through the cold months, and they did it for a reason that any child playing in sand can understand. Bare ground moves. Ground with roots in it does not. The stubble also caught snow, which meant more moisture in the soil come spring, and it created tiny air pockets near the surface that slowed the wind before it even got started. A field that looked messy and unkempt in November was 3 times less likely to be a dust cloud in April. Number 23. The contour furrow system. Flat field plowing runs in straight lines from fence to fence, which is efficient and which is also catastrophic in drought conditions because it gives water and wind a straight path to follow. The surviving homesteaders plowed their furrows in curves that followed the shape of the land, the way a river follows a valley. When rain did come, even a thin drizzle, those curved furrows trapped the water before it could run off. It soaked in instead of sliding away. It sounds simple because it is simple. A man with a plow and a good eye for slope could convert his entire planting field to contour furrows in a single week. And the difference in soil moisture retention was measured in years of survival. Number 22. Saving the seeds of whatever survived. This is not complicated, but it is one of the most important things on this list. If a variety of wheat grew and the neighbor's wheat died, you saved every single seed from that plant. You did not sell it. You did not eat it. You dried it, wrapped it in cloth, and put it in a tin container in the coolest part of your root cellar. Next spring, you planted those seeds and you saved again from whatever grew best. Within 2 or 3 seasons, a farmer doing this consistently had a locally adapted strain of his crop that was measurably more resistant to drought and wind damage than anything sold from a seed catalog. These were not fancy hybrid seeds. They were just the survivors of your specific land, selected by the land itself. Number 21. Growing sorghum instead of corn in the worst years. Corn was what most Oklahoma and Texas farmers had always grown. It was what the market wanted. It was also a crop that needed 14 inches of rain during growing season, and in the worst Dust Bowl years, some counties got 4. Sorghum needed half that. The farmers who switched to sorghum in 1934 and 1935, even partially, kept their families fed and kept their livestock alive when the corn farmers had nothing. Sorghum was not glamorous. It did not make as much money. It made enough. Enough is what kept the lights on. Number 20. The subsoil plow trick. Standard plowing turned over the top 8 to 10 inches of soil. The hardpan layer below that, baked solid by drought, was essentially a concrete shelf that roots could not penetrate and water could not pass through. The farmers who figured out the subsoil plow used a special blade that went 18 to 24 inches down and broke that hardpan layer without bringing it to the surface. The topsoil stayed on top. The hardpan cracked. Rainwater could now sink deep instead of pooling and evaporating. Roots could go deep instead of cooking in the shallow, scorched layer. This one tool, used correctly, could turn a failing field into a surviving one within a single growing season. Number 19. Using cover crops as a sacrifice. When you knew a field was going to be hard to grow cash crops in, you planted it with something cheap and fast and low water instead, and then you plowed that cover crop under before it died. Rye was the most common. It grew fast, it had dense roots, it held the soil, and when you plowed it under, it added organic matter back to the dirt that had been baking for years. Farmers who used cover crops were essentially buying time for their real fields, keeping the soil alive in a kind of suspended animation until the rain came back. The ones who left fields bare were watching their topsoil blow to St. Louis. Number 18. Tying wet burlap over well openings. This sounds minor. It is not minor at all. When the dust storms came, they carried a particular type of ultra-fine alkaline soil that could contaminate a water well almost instantly. A well that took a man 2 weeks to dig by hand could be rendered undrinkable in a single afternoon. The farmers who kept their wells sealed with wet burlap during storm season, re-wetting the burlap every morning, kept their water clean. The ones who did not were hauling water from town in barrels, or digging new wells they could not afford. Water was the difference between staying and leaving. Every trick that protected water was worth 100 that protected crops. If you have made it this far and found even one of these tricks useful, do yourself a favor and subscribe. We have an entire series on homestead survival knowledge coming, and the people watching this channel are exactly the kind of people who need to know this stuff before it disappears entirely. Number 17. The shade board for seedlings. Starting young plants in the ground during Dust Bowl conditions meant exposing them to sun that could hit 110 degrees by noon, and winds that would sandblast a tender shoot into nothing before it had a chance. The surviving farmers built simple flatboards, propped at an angle on sticks driven into the ground, that cast shade over newly planted seedlings during the worst heat of the afternoon, while still letting morning light through. Some of them used old feed sacks stretched on wire frames. It did not matter what the material was. What mattered was that the plant had 4 hours a day in which it was not being cooked. That was enough. That was all it needed. Number 16. Reading the sky for dust storm warnings. The storms came from the north and northwest, almost always. They started as a thin, dark line on the horizon that looked like a distant range of mountains. Experienced farmers could tell from the color and the speed of that line how much time they had. Brown meant loose topsoil, maybe 45 minutes. Black meant the storm had gathered layers. It was moving fast, and you had 20 minutes to get your animals in, and your well covered and your family inside. The children of these farmers learned the sky the same way city children learn traffic lights. It was not intuition. It was a precise body of knowledge built from years of watching and surviving. The farmers who learned to read it correctly had time to protect what mattered. Number 15. Keeping a root cellar fully stocked by July. Most farmers stocked their root cellars in the fall after harvest. The Dust Bowl survivors had learned to have their cellar full by July at the latest, because in drought years there was no guarantee there would be a fall harvest at all. If July came, and you had enough dried beans, cured meat, lard, cornmeal, and canned goods to last 8 months, a crop failure in August was a disaster, but not a death sentence. If July came, and your cellar was half empty, you were dependent on a harvest that might never arrive. The psychological security of a full cellar also changed the quality of a farmer's decisions. A desperate man makes desperate choices. A man with a full root cellar can think clearly. Number 14. The water harvest from fog and dew. In the most desperate dry years, some Dust Bowl farmers in areas where morning fog was even slightly possible built what they called dew catchers. These were sheets of metal, later replaced with canvas or even old cloth, angled to direct condensation into a central low point that drained into a barrel. A good dew catcher on a foggy morning could collect 3 to 5 gallons before the sun burned the moisture off. This was not enough to irrigate crops. It was enough to keep a small kitchen garden alive. And a kitchen garden that was alive in the 3rd year of a drought, when you had no income and no credit and no neighbors left, was the difference between a family that ate and a family that did not. Number 13. Never selling the last cow. This was a rule that the smartest Dust Bowl farmers held to with almost religious intensity. Banks, government agencies, and desperate circumstances all conspired to push farmers to sell their last breeding stock for short-term cash. The families that refused, even when it meant eating very poorly for months, still had the foundation of a herd when the rains came back. The families that sold the last cow had nothing. Starting over from zero on a farm is nearly impossible without either borrowed money or inherited stock. Keeping one cow alive through a bad year on hay you cut by hand from a dry roadside ditch was one of the hardest things a person could do, and also one of the smartest. If any of your grandparents or great-grandparents lived through the Dust Bowl, share this video with your family. This is their history. Number 12 is one of the tricks that almost nobody talks about. Number 12. The dry composting pile. In normal years, composting meant piling organic waste with water and letting it rot down into fertile soil amendment. In drought conditions, you had no water to spare for a compost pile. What the surviving farmers did instead was build a dry compost system. Kitchen scraps, dried crop waste, animal manure, even ash from the stove. They piled it in a shaded corner behind the barn or house and covered it loosely with boards to keep the worst of the dust out. They did not water it. They just kept adding to it. It broke down slowly, imperfectly, nothing like the rich, crumbly compost you get from a well-managed pile. But after a year, what was at the bottom of that pile was organic matter that could be worked into the soil, and organic matter was what those baked fields were screaming for. Number 11. Cooking with a haybox oven. Fuel was a serious problem in the Dust Bowl years. Wood was scarce on the plains. Coal cost money. Kerosene cost money. The haybox method, which had been used by settlers decades earlier, came back into common use. You brought a pot of beans or soup or stew to a full boil on whatever fuel you had. Then you wrapped it in hay, blankets, or any insulating material available, and sealed it inside a wooden box. The pot stayed hot enough to continue cooking for 4 to 6 hours without any additional fuel. A pot of beans that would normally require 2 hours of steady flame required 20 minutes and then nothing. Over a year, this saved enough fuel to matter significantly in a family's budget. And saved fuel meant saved money. And saved money in the Dust Bowl meant 1 more month you did not have to leave. Number 10. Breeding animals specifically for drought hardiness. The farmers who kept animals through the Dust Bowl did not do it by feeding and watering them the same way you would in a normal year. They selected, bought, and traded for specific breeds and individual animals that had already proven they could maintain condition on less. Hereford cattle over Angus in many areas, because Herefords had been bred for the dry West. Spanish goats over dairy breeds, because Spanish goats could find nutrition in scrubby growth that other animals would not touch. Chickens were fed dried insects and kitchen scraps rather than grain. The animals that could not adapt were sold or eaten. The ones that could adapt became the breeding stock for the next generation. Within 5 years, a farmer doing this consistently had animals qualitatively different from anything he started with. Number 9. The emergency seed bank in the church. This one is largely forgotten, and it should not be forgotten. In many small communities across Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and the Dakotas, the local church served as a community seed repository. Families brought their best saved seeds after harvest, labeled and dated, and the church stored them in a dry, safe place. If a family lost their crop completely, if their stored seed rotted or blew away, or was eaten by mice, they could come to the church and borrow seed for next spring. They were expected to return twice what they borrowed after their next harvest. It was an informal system with no enforcement mechanism except community reputation, and it worked. The communities that maintained these seed banks had measurably higher rates of replanting after disaster years than those that did not. Number 8. Mulching with anything flat and dry. Bare soil evaporates moisture at a terrifying rate when the sun and wind are both working against you. The trick that many surviving farmers used was to cover the ground around every plant with whatever flat, dry material they could find. Old newspapers, which were still cheap. Cardboard from feed sacks. Dried grass cut from roadsides. Boards laid flat. Even flat rocks, which absorbed heat during the day and released it at night while blocking evaporation during the day. Any covering on the soil surface between plants reduced moisture loss significantly. Farmers who mulched their kitchen gardens in May were still eating fresh food in August when their unmulched neighbors had given up on gardens entirely. Number 7. The trick with locust beans that made the county grain elevator nervous. Before the Dust Bowl, most Oklahoma and Kansas farmers treated black locust trees as nuisances. They spread aggressively, they were thorny and difficult, and they were not a cash crop. Then the hard years came and farmers started noticing something. The ground under black locust groves stayed softer. It held moisture better. Locust flowers fed bees when nothing else was blooming. And the seed pods, locust beans, were actually high in protein and could be ground into a supplemental flour or fed directly to cattle, pigs, and chickens. Farmers who had locust groves on their land started actively encouraging them rather than clearing them. The county grain elevator did not like this because it meant farmers were less dependent on purchased feed grain. In 3 counties, informal pressure was applied through local agricultural agents to discourage locust cultivation. The farmers who ignored this pressure and kept their locust groves were feeding their animals for free, while their neighbors were buying feed they could not afford. Number 6. The half-acre kitchen garden rule. Acre kitchen. Successful Dust Bowl homesteaders almost universally maintained a kitchen garden of no less than half an acre that was separate from their cash crop fields and treated with significantly more care. The cash crop fields got whatever water was left. The kitchen garden got the first water, always, even in the worst drought. It was hand-watered from barrels when necessary. It was mulched. It was planted with drought-tolerant varieties. It was protected with shade boards and windbreaks of its own. The reasoning was brutally practical. Cash crops made money in good years. The kitchen garden kept the family alive in bad years. Keeping the family alive was the prerequisite for everything else. Number 5. Banking soil against the north side of the house. Cold winters compounded the misery of drought summers. The Dust Bowl winters were also severe, and heating a prairie farmhouse was expensive. Farmers who banked loose soil or straw against the north foundation wall of their homes every October, essentially building a thick insulating berm against the outside wall, reduced their heating fuel requirements significantly. The house stayed warmer on cold nights without additional wood or coal. In spring, they removed the banking and spread it on the garden. The same material doing 2 jobs: insulation in winter, soil amendment in spring. This is the kind of closed-loop thinking that defined Dust Bowl survival. Nothing was used for only one purpose. Number 4. The livestock water trough in the root cellar. Every gallon of water that sat in an open trough under the sun in 90-degree heat evaporated at a rate that would astonish you. Farmers who had the space ran a trough or tank into the shade of their root cellar, or kept it in the barn where the animals and the structure itself reduced temperature. Some of them buried wooden barrels into the ground so that only the top was exposed, using the earth itself as insulation. Water kept at 60 degrees underground evaporated at a fraction of the rate of water sitting in a surface trough at 95. In a drought, this single change could save enough water over a summer to keep an additional animal alive. Number 3. Never breaking new ground in drought years. This seems obvious in retrospect and was not obvious at all at the time. When crops failed, the natural human response was to expand, to try more acres, to hope that ground that had never been farmed would somehow be more productive than the existing fields. The farmers who survived were the ones who did the opposite. They contracted. They focused their effort and their precious water on the best performing acres they had, and let the marginal ground rest, kept covered with whatever stubble or native grass would grow. Breaking new ground in drought conditions exposed raw subsoil that had almost no organic matter and no established root systems, and turned it into a dust source within one season. The instinct to expand was the instinct that ruined the most farms. Number 2. Trading skills instead of money. By 1935, cash was essentially gone from large parts of the rural Great Plains. The surviving homesteads were the ones whose owners had quietly built a reputation for something specific that their neighbors needed. One man might be the best well digger in the county. Another might be the best at veterinary work with cattle. A woman might be the region's best bread baker, or the most skilled at canning. These skills became currency. A day of well digging was worth a side of pork. 3 hours of veterinary work was worth seed corn for a season. The families that had nothing to trade except unskilled labor were always the most vulnerable. The families with a recognizable specialty always had something to offer, and always found someone willing to offer something back. Skill was the only form of capital that a drought could not take away from you. And now, the trick that Harold Gibbs used the morning after he watched his neighbor's barn disappear into the black wall, the one that his grandfather had taught him, the one that the agricultural history books never mention because it is small and unglamorous, and it is the single most important thing on this entire list. Number 1. The morning soil check. Every single morning, without exception, Harold walked to the lowest part of his field, knelt down, dug his bare hand 6 inches into the soil, and held a fistful of it in his palm. He was not measuring anything. He had no instruments. He was feeling. He was feeling for moisture, for texture, for the fine crumble or the caked hardness that told him what was happening below the surface where he could not see. Over years and decades, a farmer who did this every morning developed a sensitivity to the soil that was not mystical at all, but was absolutely precise. He knew, within 1 or 2 days, when a rain was likely because the soil changed before the clouds formed. He knew which sections of his field were retaining moisture, and which were drying faster. He knew when his cover crop was failing before it showed signs above ground. He knew when the hardpan was cracking and when it was solid. This daily physical contact with the land was not a ritual or a superstition. It was data collection by the only instrument available, the human hand, and the farmers who did it consistently made better decisions than any government agricultural guide recommended. They planted earlier or later than the calendar said. They moved their water to different fields than the ones they had planned to irrigate. They recognized the warning signs of a failing field weeks before the damage was irreversible and made changes while changes were still possible. Harold Gibbs could walk his field blindfolded and tell you within a 20-foot radius which section was in trouble. He learned this by doing it every single morning for 40 years, starting when he was a boy following his grandfather across cracked Oklahoma clay before the sun was fully up. The soil check cost nothing. It required no tools. It required no education. It required only the discipline to do it every day without exception, and the willingness to actually listen to what you found. This is why Harold's homestead survived, and his neighbors did not. Not because Harold was smarter or luckier or had more money, because Harold paid attention every single morning without fail, and because his grandfather had taught him that the land will always tell you what it needs if you are willing to get down on your knees and ask. There are people watching this right now whose grandparents did every single one of these things. There are others watching who have never grown anything more demanding than a houseplant. What the Dust Bowl proved, Definitively, and without possibility of argument, is that knowledge is the most durable form of wealth that exists. The banks failed, the crops failed, the government programs helped some and missed more, but the knowledge, held in the hands and the habits of the people who had earned it through generations of paying attention, that knowledge survived. It produced food in conditions that should have made food impossible. It kept families on land that every external force was trying to drive them from. If even one of these 25 tricks has made you think differently about what it means to actually know how to grow food, leave a comment right now and tell us which one hit you hardest. We read every comment. We build our next videos based on what you tell us. And if you made it to the end of this video, you are exactly the kind of person we make this channel for. We will see you in the next one.